For the subjectivist, the world in a sense is value neutral. There aren't any values in the world until you start to have certain feelings of approbation or disapprobation. There aren't any values in the world until you approve or disapprove of something. The world is valueless and neutral until you have a particular type of feeling towards something. So suppose that you're walking along around your neighborhood and you see that, God forbid, some kids are torturing a puppy. The amount of time it takes from the light to travel from them to you, which is a very short amount of time, but still, there's that gap there. That action is neither right nor wrong. It's value neutral. And when the light reaches your eyes and then you experience that feeling of disapprobation, when you experience disapproval, then the act becomes wrong. But before then, the act is neither right nor wrong. One thing subjectivists worry about is that we have this propensity to spread our minds onto objects, to spread our minds onto reality and think that what we're talking about is really out there, when in fact, it's in here. So we call water hot or cold, when in fact, the hot or coldness is a sensation in here. We call sugar sweet, as if sugar were actually sweet. But sugar, the sweetness isn't in the sugar. The sweetness, in a sense, is in you and how you're so constituted that when you taste sugar, you get that sensation of sweet. So when we talk about water as hot or sugar as sweet, it sounds like we're talking about water and sugar. But the subjectivist says, no, you're really talking about yourself. And we think we're talking about the world, and we're not. So perhaps in the case of morality, there's this tendency as well to spread our minds onto objects and think that we're talking about what's going on in the world, when really, the world is value neutral. The rightness or wrongness is in here. Let's talk about some arguments in support of subjectivism. We're just going to canvass a couple. And one argument you've already seen before, in a sense, when we talked about cultural relativism. Subjectivists tend to be empiricist. They tend to be motivated by the idea that knowledge, and really any significant sort of knowledge, must come through the senses. They often think that the sciences are the only discipline that gives us genuine knowledge of the world, and everything else is just opinion. So if knowledge really only comes through the senses, then they're going to ask, if there's supposed to be these objective moral facts, if there are supposed to be these universal moral truths that apply to all people at all times, how in the world did we sense that to discover it? Because you look out into the physical world and you don't see rightness or wrongness. It's not there to see. So imagine that you're standing at an intersection, a busy intersection, and an older woman with a cane starts to cross the intersection when it's her turn to go. And suddenly a teenager runs out into the street and kicks the cane out from under her and runs away laughing. And now she's sort of sprawling on her back like a turtle, and her time is running out, and pretty soon cars will be hurling toward her. That looks like a morally bad state of affairs. It looks like what the teenager did was evil. But what are you really seeing with your eyes? What are you truly seeing? You might say, well, I do see the wrongness. But you don't. You just see, to be honest, various shapes and colors. If we're really honest about what we see far less than what we take ourselves to see. For instance, you might say that you see a remote control here. Well, that's fine. You can speak that way, and it's much more efficient to speak that way. But really focus on what you're actually seeing. And what you're actually seeing is just one side of a remote. You're inferring there's a back side, which is fine. But truly, your sensory experience is only of one side of the remote. I say that I see you, and you say that you see me, but if we're standing next to each other we really don't see each other unless we're identical to our bodies. If we are identical to our brains, then our bodies are sort of like the shell that keeps us from falling onto the sidewalk. That means that when you only see the shell, you really don't see the person. You just see evidence of the person. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't say that I see you and you see me. That's fine. But that way of talking is, in a sense, misleading, because we really don't see each other if we are identical to our brains. So then, if we see a lot less than we think we see, if we tend to form beliefs that have a lot more content than what can truly be derived from our sensory experience, let's think about that case again of the older woman walking across the street. And ask yourself, what do I truly see? You might think that you see the rightness or wrongness, but where? Where would the rightness or wrongness be? It's not something that can be discovered scientifically. If that were the case, then moral problems would have gone away some time ago as they started solving certain scientific dilemmas. They would have figured out certain scientific truths and also probably stumbled upon moral rightness or wrongness and then solved all the mysteries to the most difficult moral questions. But that's not the way it works, because it's not the sort of thing that you can observe with the eyes. But if it's not out there in the world to be seen, the subjectivist asks, where could it be? Well, if it's not out there, notice something. When you make a moral judgment, you judge that's wrong. There's something going on in here. You have a feeling of disapproval. And that must be what makes something right or wrong. Not the actual features of the situation, but your attitude, your response to the situation. We can't actually see it with the eyes or sense it in any way. But if we turn our mind's eye inward, what do we notice? A feeling of disapproval. That, says the subjectivist and some empiricists, that is the wrongness. That's what makes an act right or wrong. When we talked about cultural relativism, we saw that the cultural relativist view implies that the minority point of view is always mistaken. Subjectivism is a lot like cultural relativism. In fact, subjectivism is just another kind of relativism. Not relativism with respect to the culture, but relativism with respect to the individual. But a lot of people think that cultural relativism has got a problem here, because it seems obvious to them that the minority point of view isn't always mistaken or isn't automatically mistaken. That you can be in the minority point of view and still be correct. If that weren't the case, why ever be in the minority point of view? You might be in the minority point of view because you want the culture to agree with you, but why would you want the culture to agree with you when they're right? You want them to agree with you when you're wrong? That doesn't make much sense. But if you think, hey, sometimes you can be in the minority and be correct, that might doesn't make right, but you're like relativism, then subjectivism may be the way to go. Because if subjectivism is true and your moral judgments deviate from your culture's moral judgments, you could still be right. In fact, most likely you will be right, which is something we'll talk about later. That when it comes to, if you're a subjectivist or if subjectivism is true, your moral judgments almost always track the truth. You're almost always right in your moral judgments. Some worry also that if cultural relativism is true, that would suppress or quell any freedom of thought or expression, any individual thought. There'd be no reason to think through things because, hey, the culture is already determined what's right or wrong. What's there to think about? There would be no reason to question your inherited values, which seems to be a rite of passage for any teenager, to question what they've been taught and to rebel against it. But that's only the case, says the subjectivist, if subjectivism is true. Then you can question those things. The culture doesn't determine what's right or wrong. As to why you would question them, that's going to be a problem for the subjectivists, as we'll see. Because if subjectivism is true, there still isn't anything really to question you're right and everyone else is right. And there's no reason to think, well, my parents were wrong. You just think, hey, my views are starting to differ from what they were before. And so my parents are right, but I'm right as well, even though I disagree with my parents. And finally, another argument in favor of subjectivism. Sometimes we use good and I like it interchangeably. So if I come home from work and I see my 5-year-old son Ethan sitting at the table and he's eating chocolate ice cream, he has ice cream all over his face, I'm going to ask, is that good? And he might say, yeah, I like it. I like it a lot. With reply to the question, is it good? It seems appropriate to say, yeah, I like it, as in liking it makes it good. Or if I were to say to him, hey, do you like that ice cream? And he'd say, yeah, it's good. It's really good. Then again, it seems like good and I like it are interchangeable. And the subjectivist says that's just true of morality. Although we use the language of approval or disapproval, an act is right when I like it, in a sense. Now, there are cases where we use the word good, and we're not using it as interchangeable with I like it. So if your parents say, broccoli is good for you, and you say, but I don't like it, so it must not be good for me, you probably misunderstood them. There's a case where it seems like it's being good for you has nothing to do with whether you like it or not. But nevertheless, there are still those cases where good and like it are interchangeable, and that's evidence for thinking subjectivism is true. People like to say what's true for you is not true for me, or your truth isn't the same as my truth. And that's probably an expression you should stay away from because it's quite misleading. What people usually mean is, well, what I believe isn't the same thing as what you believe. Of course, if that's what they're trying to express, then that's what they should say. They shouldn't be talking about truth. They should be saying, hey, my beliefs differ from yours. But in fact, there are a few limited cases in which it makes sense to say what's true for you is not true for me. And one of the few cases is if subjectivism about morality is true. It does make sense to say what's true for you is not true for me. And the reason is because according to the subjectivist, an act is right when I approve of it. And an act is right when you approve of it, or an act is wrong when you disapprove of it. When we make moral judgments, like I said, we have this propensity to spread the mind onto objects and think we're talking about the objects. But the subjectivist says, no, what we're really talking about is ourselves. So when we make moral judgments, we're not really talking about the same thing. I'm talking about myself, you are talking about yourself. And in that case, it's possible that what's true for me is not true for you. Here's an example. Suppose I say, I was born in Arizona. Take that expression. I was born in Arizona. That expression is true for me. But if you were to utter that exact same sentence, if you were to say, I was born in Arizona, for most of you that claim would be false because you weren't born in Arizona. Notice we're uttering the same sentence. I'm saying I was born in Arizona. You're saying I was born in Arizona. But notice the word I there changes the referent based on who's uttering the sentence. When I utter the sentence, the I refers to me. When you utter the sentence, the I refers to you. And if that's the case, it seems quite possible that what's true for me is not true for you. Here's a case in point that it's true for me that I was born in Arizona, but false for you. So those are those limited cases where it does make sense to say that. But because there are those limited cases, don't think it extends to everything else. You shouldn't say, for instance, God exists for me, but he doesn't exist for you, or it's true for me that God exists, and true for you that God doesn't exist. Because in that case, we're not just talking about what we believe. We're saying, there's a fact of the matter, God exists. Oh, and also, there's this other fact of the matter that God doesn't exist. And that's just not possible. I may not know a lot of things, but I do know this. God doesn't both exist and not exist at the same time. It's either one or the other, and not both. You'll notice people don't say, when they're talking about whether there's a table in front of them, well, it's true for me that there's a table in front of us, but not true for you. No one uses it in that context. Why? Well, for one, people usually don't disagree about that. But even if they were, they're not really talking about, when they make a judgment about whether there's a table in front of them, they're not really talking about themselves. They're talking about the table. And in that case, there's only one truth. Either the table's in front of them or it isn't. It can't be true for me, but false for you. However, if what we're talking about is really not tables and God and the external world, but really ourselves, then it can be the case that what's true for me is not true for you. Case in point, I was born in Arizona. True for me, but not true for you. If subjectivism is true, then when I say abortion is morally wrong, what am I saying? I disapprove of abortion. When you say abortion is morally right, you're saying you approve of abortion. Well, can I approve of abortion and you disapprove of it at the same time? Yeah. So it's true for me that I approve of it. True for you that you disapprove of it. What's true for me is not true for you. What's true for me is that, let's say, abortion is wrong. What's true for you is that abortion is morally permissible. That's where it does make sense to say that. So if you're not a subjectivist, you'll want to stay away from that kind of claim. It's very popular. People use that all the time. But whether it makes a lot of sense, it's not clear that it does.